Today, as we celebrate this feast of the presentation of our blessed Lord in the temple, we remember that traditionally this was always called the purification. And it's called the purification because 40 days after the birth of a child, the mother had to be purified because the flow of blood that happens in a birth causes the woman to become ritually impure. So she had to go through these Jewish purification ceremonies. And also, on the 40th day after the birth of a child, if it is a male child who is the firstborn, that child would have to be redeemed. That goes all the way back to the time of the Exodus, and you'll see that in the 13th chapter of the book of Exodus, where Moses speaks about that. And because the Israelite children, the firstborn males of the Israelites, were spared at the time of the Passover, the Israelites from that time forward had to offer a sacrifice of redemption rather than offering a child. And so for the poor, that was to be 2 turtle doves or young pigeons. And so that's what we see going on in the gospel today. However, there are a couple of problems with this. First of all, Mary did not need to be purified because there was no flow of blood, because the birth of Jesus was a miraculous birth. It was not according to the ordinary way that you and I were born. There was no opening of the birth canal. Jesus was born miraculously, just as he was able to get out of the tomb or into the room where the apostles were without anything, without having to just walk through the wall. So too, he came into Our Lady's womb without the regular opening, and he came out without the regular opening. Fathers of the Church saw that as an indication or prefiguration of the restoration of our humanity in the resurrection of our Lord. So that being the case, St. Luke obviously recognized this, and he tells us that when the days were completed for their purification, because that didn't seem to make any sense, even someone as great as St. Jerome, who knew the Old Testament well and knew that this was about the mother being purified, changed that to say when it came time for her purification. But that's not what it says. It says when it came time for their purification. So we have to ask the question, who is they when it's supposed to be the mother? And it tells us that they offered this sacrifice of the pigeons or turtle doves, but that's to redeem the child. Jesus is the Redeemer. He didn't need to be redeemed. He came to redeem us. And on top of that, you look at it and you recognize that St. Luke is going way out of his way to make the point that this is done according to the law of God. 3 times in this little passage at the beginning of the gospel today, he tells us, according to the law of Moses, it is written in the law of the Lord, and in accordance with the dictates of the law of the Lord. So 3 times St. Luke is telling us all these things were done according to the law of God. And yet, they didn't need to be done with regard to Jesus and Mary. So then, again, we have to ask ourselves, who are we talking about? Well, there is a point that is clear in the Greek that is not at all clear in the English, because in English we only have one word for Jerusalem, and that is Jerusalem. In the Greek there are 2 different words for Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which means the secular city of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem, which is the holy city of Jerusalem. Up to this point in St. Luke's Gospel, every time he speaks of Jerusalem, he uses the spelling of the secular city of Jerusalem. And after this passage, he uses the spelling for the holy city of Jerusalem. And so it is Jerusalem and the people thereof who needed to be purified. We see that same thing with the redemption of Jesus. If the sacrifice is offered for the redemption of the firstborn, listen again to what we heard toward the end of the gospel. When Anna, the prophetess, recognizes who Jesus is, what does she do? She gave thanks and spoke about the child to all who were awaiting the redemption of Jerusalem. So this wasn't about the redemption of the child any more than it was about the purification of the mother. It was all done according to the law of God because it was Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem that needed to be purified. Because 33 years later, this is where the sacrifice, which brings about our redemption and our purification, is going to happen. So that's exactly what we see going on here today. Now, we have to take this then a step further and say, okay, that's fine. What's this have to do with anything else? Well, it has to do with you and me. We are the New Jerusalem. We're members of the New Jerusalem. And the tragedy is when we look at the ancient Jerusalem, 2,000 years ago when our Lord was born, and we hear about this a couple of weeks ago when we celebrated the Epiphany, when the Magi came, we are told that Herod was troubled. That makes sense. But the tragedy is in the line that comes right after. Herod was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. The people didn't want Jesus. And they were troubled by our Lord's presence, by his birth. There were, thankfully, this handful of people, as we hear about, with Anna speaking to the people looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. But most of the people didn't want him. Fast forward 2,000 years. Most people don't want Jesus today. Even those who have been baptized, many, many, many have walked away. They don't want the Lord. They're troubled by his presence. And that leaves the small handful, which includes you and me. We are the ones today that Anna was speaking to, the ones looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. But we have to take this now a step further still, because we heard in the first reading that there will come to the temple suddenly the Lord whom you seek. So the Lord is going to be coming to his temple to be presented. And that presentation is for redemption, and it is for purification. It's exactly what the prophet Malachi tells us in the first reading today. He says, he will sit refining and will purify the sons of Levi, so that the sacrifices of Jerusalem and Judah will please the Lord, as in the days of old, as in years gone by. Purification and redemption. You say, okay, but still, what's that have to do with me? St. Paul says, do you not know that you are the temple of the Lord? You are the temple of the Lord. What's going to happen in just a few minutes when you come up for communion? The Lord whom you seek is suddenly going to come to the temple. Now, if you're in the state of sanctifying grace, the Lord dwells within you 24 hours a day by his indwelling presence. But when you receive him in Holy Communion, he is present sacramentally in you at that time. So the Lord will come to his temple. And he's going to come to that temple in order to purify and in order to prepare us so that we can offer pleasing sacrifice to the Lord. Once again, we see some of that in the second reading. St. Paul, when he wrote his letter to the Hebrews, talks about the fact that he came to destroy death and the power of death, the devil, and to free those who their whole life were slaves of fear. And then tells us that he was going to expiate the sins of the people, and he says, because he himself was tested through what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. That's the purification. God allows the suffering in our lives to help purify our souls. And our souls need to be purified so that we can love more perfectly and thereby offer more perfect sacrifice to the Lord. Now, if we look at the temple, at the sacrifices of old, was there something about them that was displeasing to God? No. When we look at the sacrifice of the New Testament, it is absolutely perfect. It's the sacrifice of Jesus. There is absolutely nothing that is displeasing to God in the sacrifice of the Lord. But what about you and me who are offering sacrifice to the Lord? What's our disposition? Do we really have that disposition of the love of God? Are we really seeking that union with God? Are we trying our best to conform ourselves to the Lord? That's why we need to be purified, so that we can offer sacrifice which is acceptable to the Lord. So yes, the sacrifice of our Lord is perfectly pleasing, but our sacrifice can always be more pleasing because it can be offered with greater love and with greater reverence. And that's something then that each one of us needs to really consider and to look at deeply within ourselves. Because, as I mentioned, so many have walked away from our Lord, but there are many Catholics who just kind of go through the motions. You can just look within your own self right now and ask yourself the simple question, why am I here right now? Why am I here? Is it because I have to be? Because I'm required to be? Because I'm just putting in my time? Or is it because I want to be here? Is it because I am here out of love for the Lord? Once again, as we look at that, we can maybe start to see that maybe our disposition needs to be adjusted a little bit so that we're truly here out of love for God. And then our sacrifices are pleasing to Him. If we're just going through the motions, that's not going to be pleasing. Imagine standing before the Lord on the day of judgment and say, well, I showed up, didn't I? It's like, yeah, you were there in the pew, a warm breathing body. Did you put your heart into it? Did you love? Were you really united with the sacrifice of our Lord? Did you really care? And all these things that we've talked about, so profound and so beautiful. Many people, when they hear it, will say, yeah, whatever. That's cool, but big deal. It's not just whatever. This is about you and me. This is about what goes on in the temple of the Lord, and you are the temple of the Lord. This is about the Lord coming to us, and now we come to Him. And what is our disposition as we come to Him? These things have profound meaning for us if we are willing to allow this in, if we're willing to allow our hearts to be conformed to His. So again, think about that as we go through the Mass. As our Lord offers His sacrifice for your redemption, for your purification, then ask yourself, what's my disposition as I come forward to receive Him in Holy Communion? Do I have that same loving disposition toward Him that He has toward me? That's what we have to be about. That's what we're celebrating today. Yes, 2,000 years ago, our Lord was presented in the temple, and all these things according to the dictates and the law of the Lord. Today, 2,000 years later, He continues to be presented in the temple. So this isn't something that just happened 2,000 years ago. We can leave it at an arm's distance. It's something that is literally happening inside of you right now. That cannot be at an arm's distance. But we can keep it separate from ourselves if we choose to do so. So we have to make that choice to put our disposition, our hearts in that right perspective, so that we're here out of love for Him. Everything we're doing is out of love for Him. And as we are purified through the actions of our Lord, the redemption that is ours in Him will allow us to offer sacrifice which is truly pleasing to the Lord.